Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for joining us for the release of the Muslim Public Affairs Council's Safe Spaces Initiative. My name is Hoda El-Shishtawi, Hoda, H-O-D-A, El-Shishtawi, E-L-S-H-I-S-H-T-A-W-Y, and I am MPAC's National Policy Analyst. We're here this morning on the day before the one-year anniversary of the Boston Marathon bombing to announce the first national grassroots effort to equip American Muslim communities with practical tools for developing healthy communities, as well as intervention strategies for troubled individuals. This morning's press conference will begin with remarks from our featured guests, followed by questions and answers. Today we will be hearing from Haris Tureen, the director of MPAC's Washington, D.C. office, Alejandro Butel, author of Safe Spaces Initiative Toolkit and an independent research consultant, Imam Mohammed Ali, the executive director of the All Dulles Area Muslim Society, or Adam Center. He is also the president of the Islamic Society of North America, ISNA, and Imam William Webb, resident scholar for the Islamic Society of Boston Cultural Center. And I'd like to turn your attention now to our first speaker, Haris Tureen.
Thank you, Huda. My name is Haris Tureen, and I'm the director of the Washington, D.C. office of the Muslim Public Affairs Council. And the spelling is H-A-R-I-S, last name T-A-R-I-N. On the eve of the anniversary of the Boston Marathon bombings, our thoughts and prayers are with the families and friends of the loved ones who were killed and injured in this most heinous attack. Last year, we prayed along with millions of other Muslims from every corner of the world for the safety and well-being of every person involved in the attack and for the culprits to be identified and apprehended quickly. The people of Boston have been an inspiring embodiment of what it means to be Boston strong. On that tragic day and in the days after, all Americans stood together to mourn the victims and demonstrate that our unity will not be broken by such senseless violence. American Muslims were among the runners in the marathon, as well as part of the rescue and medical efforts that saved lives. 5 days after the attack, the news that those who perpetuated the attacks were two young men from the Boston area, who also happened to be Muslim, was a devastating blow to our community. It has also led many within the American Muslim community to come to terms with the fact that violent extremism is an extremely isolated problem, but one that has a huge impact both on our community and our nation at large. After learning that the elder Tsarnaev brother was ejected from 2 Boston area mosques for his intolerant and troubling views, mosque leaders around the country turned to us at MPAC, the Muslim Public Affairs Council, in the weeks after the attacks and asked for guidance on how to deal with troubled individuals that may come to communities in the future. Every community of faith wants to protect and prevent violence at home, within their neighborhoods, and across the country. Violence has plagued our nation in the recent years, in schools, shopping malls, movie theaters, military bases, and just yesterday in a community center of a faith community. And we never know when the next troubled individual who may be suffering from a mental health issue or may be convinced by someone who has problematic thoughts on the internet may strike. Since last spring, we have worked to create community-based solutions to address the isolated but dangerous possibility of any individual who may fall prey to extreme violent ideologies. And that's what our Safe Space Initiatives is about. What we seek to do is to provide 2 goals: raise awareness and responsibly inform our community leaders about the limited but concrete and complicated challenges that violence and extremism pose to our families, our young people, especially by individuals who seek to prey on them online and on the internet. And number two is to provide the tips and tools to deal with this problematic situation that may arise at a mosque, at a community center, amongst young people, in a student group. As we said earlier, we understand that this is not a huge problem in terms of numbers, but the impact is large. The impact that it has on our nation, the impact that it has on our economy, the impact that it has on families who see young people behind bars for 25, 30 years. What we want to do is move away from the incarceration model. We want to move towards an intervention and rehabilitation model. We've seen it work in other parts of the world, in Europe, in certain parts of North Africa, the Middle East, where if a young, troubled individual has problematic thoughts and ideas and is moving towards a path of violence, there are places where you can stop them through theological help, through mental health services, through family counseling, and this is what the Safe Space Initiative is about. This is for our community leaders. We understand that the American Muslim community, within the American Muslim community, violent extremism is not a dinner table conversation. It should not become a dinner table conversation. But our leaders, our imams, our youth pastors should be adept in being able to handle these situations. And we, at this point, have worked with government agencies, folks in DHS, the White House, various other agencies, to brief them and to ensure that they also create an environment of trust between communities and law enforcement agencies so that a model like this can be implemented and work. Thank you.
Thank you, Haris. Now we will be hearing from Alejandro Butel, the author of the Safe Space Initiative Toolkit and an independent research here in DC.
Thank you, Hila, and thank you all for being here today. And good morning, everyone. My name is Alejandro Butel, and I'm an independent research consultant and author of the Toolkit. So that's Alejandro, Alejandro, last name Butel, Beutel. Now, if there's going to be one takeaway from this discussion today, let me give it to you right here, the bottom line up front. This publication is a practical guide to empowering communities against violence and extremism using an expanded set of tools through education and rehabilitation, not just incarceration. As Haris has already mentioned before, the most recent drive for this toolkit came after the Boston bombings took place nearly 1 year ago from today. After the attacks, many community leaders were asking what could have been done to prevent this incident from happening. We at MPAC have been asking and answering these kinds of questions for many, many years now. And for a long time, a lot of communities responded by not only condemning extremism and acts of violence, but also kicking people out of mosques and other institutions if there was extremism. The Boston bombings, however, laid bare the limitations of that strategy, which required some fresh thinking. That's where this toolkit comes in. This toolkit is MPAC's response. It is an evidence-based, values-driven approach to the issue that provides communities with an expanded set of tools to keep one's families, communities, and country safe and free. The toolkit itself is premised on the notion that a person's path to violence can be stopped, reversed, or prevented altogether with the right kind of community support. The core of the toolkit is what we call our PIE, P-I-E, framework, which stands for prevention, intervention, or ejection. Prevention is about nipping it in the bud by building strong communities through programming at our community institutions. Programming such as Safe Spaces, which is what our campaign is named after, to hold healthy discussions on hot topic issues such as foreign policy and reconciling one's religious and civic identities. In other words, what does it mean to be Muslim and American at the same time? And to answer that question and where this toolkit comes down, we unapologetically believe that faith and freedom go hand in hand. and unequivocally reject the narrative of extremists that say you can't be a pious Muslim and a loyal, productive American citizen at the same time. That said, however, there may be some individuals who are already at risk of going down a path of violence, even in the healthiest and strongest of communities, irrespective of creed, color, or religion. At the same time, not all cases of individuals on the edge of violence have to end with someone getting hurt or getting arrested. We believe one of the best approaches is a constructive intervention in the person's life, similar to how schools and universities have set up processes to prevent violent tragedies like Columbine and Virginia Tech. Even so, there will be some individuals who are so far down a path that community help may not be a viable option. In those situations, it will still be necessary to eject a person from a community space and notify law enforcement at the same time. Without notifying law enforcement, it's potentially cutting a dangerous person loose without letting the proper authorities know that there's a threat out there. Now, before just closing, one thing I do want to make very clear is that while hindsight is 20/20, there are concrete things that communities, law enforcement, and the American public at large can learn as we go into the one-year anniversary of Boston. This toolkit provides our nation with a practical and effective way of empowering ourselves to keep our communities and families safe and free based on those lessons through the case studies that we have done. We have talked to law enforcement officials, we have talked to imams, we have talked to mental health professionals. We have even interviewed ex-extremists as well from across the ideological spectrum, Muslim and non-Muslim. Even today we found out that there was a tragic shooting that took place at multiple Jewish centers and faith-based communities. We interviewed neo-Nazis as well, just to see and get some of their experiences and understandings. So we really tried to pull out all the stops in order to make sure that we could find the best solutions possible for our communities and for our nation at large. So with that, I'll leave it there and hand it over to the next person. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alejandro, and I'd like to now turn our attention over to Imam Majid, the Executive Director of Adams Center and the President of ISNA.
Yes. Good morning. My name is spelled M-A-G-I-D, Mohammed M-O-H-A-M-E-D. First, I would like, in the beginning, as a clergy, to express my deep sadness of what happened yesterday to my friends from the Jewish community, attacking any religious places, attacking all the religious places, as always believe. And it's just another reminder of standing together, addressing the issue of anti-Semitism and hate toward communities. I would like just to thank MPAC for great work of putting this toolkit together for imams and religious leaders around the United States, and they have done a great job by bringing the best practice and put it in one study that helps or kit help the imams, social workers, youth directors, and our mosque to work together addressing the issue of violence, extremism, or radicalization. As had been said, that there's a mental health issues, there's a social aspect of this, and there's a theological aspect of this. And in order for us to address this issue, you have to tackle all of these areas, and this kit provide that kind of connection to help the people in the community to create a safety net or a support group, or the people who come together from various expertise to address the issue of intervention. I would like to say that my own experience of holding internet safety workshop in my community to address the issue of radicalization online was very fruitful. We have many people who come to us and say this is the first time they realize the dangers out there. Therefore, I do believe this kit would help many imams, many social workers, and people in our community to be able to work together. In counseling, for example, if somebody comes to you with mental health issue, we do refer them to people with expertise. This kit meant to give us the understanding of this issue, of all the aspects of it. And I would like to thank you, MPAC, for a great job. Thank you.
Thank you, Imam Majid. I'd like to now turn the mic over to Imam Webb from the Islamic Society of Boston Cultural Center.
Thank you and good morning. My name is Imam William Suhaib. Suhaib is S-U-H-A-I-B, S-U-H-A-I-B, Webb, W-E-B-B. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone. It's interesting to note that I am from Boston, so I probably bring some personal and emotional experience to the situation. As someone who's worked in the capacity of an imam in America for around the last 15 years, I've actually walked through each one of those steps from PI, prevention, intervention, and expulsion, not really having the grammar or the language on how to define that process. So what this important kit does that was released by MPAC is help us to formulate a logic on how to approach a problem that is multifaceted. Every single young Muslim, and it's happened to me 7 times in my career, who's came to me with what we would consider fringe ideas or potential radical ideas. Thoughts are one thing, but turning into actions is another. Every single one of them that I was able to counsel changed and are now living fruitful and productive lives. The point being that there is something to the idea of intervention. When we approach a community from a strictly legal perspective or from a law enforcement perspective, we intimidate that community. People become shy, people become scared. That becomes somewhat more aggrandized when you're dealing with the fact that many people are from countries where if law enforcement did knock on your door, you had no sense of rights or sense of due process. So right after the Boston bombing, what I realized as a clergy was that this problem, and especially with the important article that came out in the Boston Globe about the history of the Tsarnaev brothers, is really beyond just clergy. I think that was one of the problems. Prior to that, we were expecting imams to try to do something, find somebody, then call the FBI. It's a very simplistic approach. But when you read the story of those 2 brothers, you see history of mental illness, you see history of violence, even in some ways like gang violence or related to selling of narcotics. And I had noted that some years ago that it's really beyond me. When I became imam in Boston, the second week there, I brought a clinician on campus and said, if I'm counseling, you're counseling. Not because of radicalization, but because of other problems, and also because sometimes imams, we need counselors more than anyone else. But the point was that the problems were so vast that they were beyond my scope. So this gives us a language. The second thing it does, I wrote about this in the New York Times around a year ago, an op-ed that I wrote, it puts the microphone in the hand of the Muslim community. Instead of it coming from one entity, we're now seeing partnerships building and trust building. Right after the Boston bombing, I spoke to DHS, I spoke to Carmen Ortiz, which is, of course, district attorney in our area of the Woods, and talked about the need for giving pastors some room to interfere. The need to give imams the shelter to reach out to young people, old people, whoever, and offer them pastoral support. And that was greeted with a lot of hope and excitement. So this program really gives us a language to adopt: prevention, intervention, and then expulsion. So I'm very hopeful that we can train imams from here on out on this program, and that can be implemented in our communities. And you have my support and the mosque in Boston to be 100% behind you. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'd like to now open it up to questions. I do ask that you please state your name and your affiliation.
From the Washington Post, Constable. My question is about the internet. A lot of radicalization occurs through internet contacts. A lot of young people, Muslims, others, have ideas, but they get honed and refined and sharpened through the internet. The internet is like this vast, giant universe. What can you do? What can anyone do? I know that sites have been blocked. I know that happens. But how do you combat that universe of radicalization out there, in the ether?
Sure. So that's a great question. One of the things I think when talking to the experts and then engaging even with the former extremists that I had talked to as well as part of this research was that one of the things that came out very clearly was that censorship is actually counterproductive. It is the wrong way to go. In fact, to counter bad ideas, you need to replace them with good ideas, responding with the free marketplace of ideas. So this is why it's important that communities and clergy connect with one another and talk to one another, have the safe spaces for discussion, so that things that they may read about online can then be openly discussed, tackled, debated, debunked even, within a forum by a figure of trust and authority. So that seems to be one of the key things. And the other thing is, as well, that came clear in my interviews was the role of parents, especially when dealing with young people, is just that parents should have a better relationship with their kids and just generally know what it is that they're watching and reading online. And it's not just related to extremism, it's related to sex, it's related to other forms of violence, drug use, things like that. Helping parents have better media literacy in order to then create a connection with their young kids and have those discussions so that when these things come up and they encounter them, that they then can be able to deal with the situation appropriately. I don't know if
So in my interaction with some people who had been somewhat influenced by, for example, Anwar Awlaki, censorship hasn't worked, but what does work is a counter-narrative. There was a young man one time who came to me with some ideas, and I asked him, what are you basing these understandings on? And he quoted Anwar Awlaki. I responded with a counter-argument that was held by other scholars, and he said to me, I never knew of this argument before. And then he said to me, I felt it was wrong to hate people, but I didn't have any religious kind of support for that. So the counter-narrative is very important. Secondly, and we've encouraged imams and scholars to have Facebook pages, Twitter pages. If you look at, Imam Zaid Shakr has 200,000 followers. Hamza Yusuf has 100,000 followers. Yasha Qadi has, I think, now 150,000 followers. My Facebook page now has almost 100,000 followers. So people are looking for a counter-narrative, but if it's not available, you can't find it. It's like the iPhone 5. Everybody wanted one, but no one could find one. So people are looking for that counter-narrative. It just needs to be there. So we've seen that as being very successful. And then interaction and discussions with those young people. We have stories of young people who have become radicalized through the comment section on YouTube. So not necessarily it was the video, but it was with interacting with a voice who they didn't know who it was. So we need people also to counter that through interaction.
I would like to say that we held more than one time internet safety workshop addressing the issue of radicalization online. But what we did, we brought the local sheriff to speak about internet safety in general. We brought the FBI, the Homeland Security, everyone else, and to explain what is there in the internet in terms of ideology, so that the families, they will become aware of what their children be exposed to in the internet. I would like just to confirm everything being said here, that the counter-narrative it is the most effective way of addressing the issue. We call it a meta-narrative, actually, because that narrative is not the real narrative. The meta-narrative, the real Islam, has to be taught to those young people. The other things that I would like to say that sometimes the tragedy taking place in Syria and other parts of the world play a big role in recruiting young people. Therefore, we need to have interpretation of events, how they can see all of this taking place and tragedies, and to re-explain how you can address those issues. Because lately, young people have been arrested in Duke area, Duke University. They were going to Syria because of the Syrian conflict. For we need to be able to address those issues in a very real way and to interpret them to the young people and to tell them the path of addressing them.
I would mention just a couple of things. The first thing is the idea of this toolkit and the counter-narrative that American Muslim communities work on in general is to build resiliency within our community. It's important that if there are problematic ideas that young people, but not only young people, I mean, this is not a problem amongst just young American Muslims. There are a lot of older individuals. The gentleman yesterday who walked into what he thought was a Jewish community center was in his 70s, and we've seen this. The Holocaust shooter was a person of in his 60s and 70s, and so this is not only a demographically specific problem, but it's the idea of building resiliency within the whole community. We at MPAC and with the Toolkit believe that not only the family itself, the local clergy, communities need to create safe spaces to help talk about what Imam Majid talked about, which is whether they're foreign policy grievances or domestic grievances, you can talk about all of these issues in a healthy and safe environment, and you can have positive outlets, whether that's through civic and political engagement. And this is not any type of a campaign that tries to diminish the grievances that young people or anyone might have, or generally people might have. What we actually say is that if you have a disagreement with a government policy, that's a good thing. I mean, having a disagreement, caring about your nation's trajectory of the image of your nation overseas, caring about social justice causes, this is a good thing. We should take that energy and move it towards a positive direction rather than allowing people who, what we would say are, there's dope peddlers. These are problematic idea peddlers on the internet. They have nothing to do other than try to get people to listen to their narrative. And both Imam Majid and Imam Webb were part of a series that we did in 2010 with ISNA and MPAC that had American Muslim leaders from across the country and across different ideological spectrum come together and say that if you have a grievance, it's okay. And it's okay to have objections with your government's policies, whether domestic or foreign, but there's a way to address that. And so this idea of building resilient communities is at the core of our Safe Spaces initiative.
Any other questions? Yes.
I'm a student at Georgetown University. My question is, when you're counseling people about some of their problematic ideas, how do you address that while also maintaining their confidentiality? So if they say something that's really personal, how do you balance that with the national security interest?
It's a great question. Without going into too much detail, there's an extensive discussion that takes place within the toolkit itself talking about what are the relevant laws that may apply in a lot of these situations. And one of them actually has to do even with mental health issues as opposed to simply national security ones, right? So there's been a long-standing set of laws called Tarasoft laws that have developed at each and every single individual state for the past 40-some-odd years that have tried to balance out the need for protecting someone's right to privacy while getting counsel, while at the same time also keeping in mind that they may pose a threat. The other thing as well is that whenever anyone is giving any intervention, the first thing we always tell them is you need to get a lawyer. That's absolutely important because one of the unfortunate complications living in a post-9/11 era is that there might be the possibility of running into what are called material support laws as well. And so it's very important that there's the right kind of legal counsel that's there from the very get-go, and if possible, that there's also communication with law enforcement if there's that level of trust that's consistent with it as well, to just let them know that this is what's going on. So it's a very delicate balance. There's no cookie-cutter approach to it, unfortunately, because the laws are still very gray, but definitely making sure that you check up on the mental health laws, you check up on the student privacy laws if it's a student, and making sure that you have a lawyer there who can guide you through material support if necessary.
I'll make one comment as it relates to what Alejandro talked about, to trust, building trust. As we, it's not a secret that there is in certain communities a level of distrust between federal law enforcement agencies and American Muslim communities. We have there is a level within there's a feeling within the American Muslim community that there are informants that are sent in to communities to create certain types of circumstances that would then lead to arrests that would probably not have actually been any kind of real case. That feeling exists. Now, part of having this safe space initiative work is that level of trust needs to increase a bit, both with the FBI in the communities and with local law enforcement in communities. Because we have now, it's been over 10 years, the main tool in the toolbox of law enforcement has been to arrest people, to arrest our way out of this. And the president, in his national CVE strategy, which he released in 2011, talked about changing that trajectory and starting to make a more community-based partnership model of countering violent extremism. This is from the national government, the president's CVE plan that he asked the government to implement. Now that is what we're trying to do, and we have to work towards. And this is why we, at the same time, we're reaching out to communities to pilot this program. We're also engaging DHS, the FBI, all the folks at the local law enforcement level, to try to help them come on board so that we can have an alternative path rather than just arresting people out of this situation.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Mallory Black with Mobile News Service, and I had a question. I've spoken to a lot of different Muslim groups within the area, and a lot of them have their existing programs to combat the threat of radical Islam. And I guess, would this toolkit help build on those existing efforts, or what's new about the program?
So yes, there are definitely programs especially at the local level. There are programs in places like Montgomery County, certain other parts of the country. What this program is meant to do, this initiative is meant to do, is to give a more kind of concrete, resource-specific set of tools to communities. A lot of times, communities who have programs are the communities that have a lot of resources to implement those programs. You know, if you travel across the country, you go to mosques, you go to local centers, you go to places where people congregate, you don't have a full-time counselor on staff. Sometimes you don't even have a full-time imam or clergy on staff. So what this toolkit looks to do is to not be as resource intensive. You can do this at a volunteer basis in the local community. You can have people come in on a part-time basis and help implement this project. So this is not a program that seeks to replace others, rather enhance and give more tools. I mean, if you look at you have the executive summary. If you look at the full report, it's over 150 pages because there's lists of resources, there's law enforcement resources, there's mental health resources, there's so many other resources that we list there so that communities can start to build, as Imam Majid mentioned, a network of support. That's also key. A network of support that if there's an issue, I can call someone. If I live in rural Iowa, I can call someone in Washington or in Los Angeles or Chicago and maybe get some support. Anybody else want to address this one?
Yeah, and I think the other value added to this is that it's taking together a lot of these programs perhaps that you've come across in speaking to these different community leaders and assembling them within one document and taking the best practices that are there while combining it with expert testimony and even the testimony from people who were extremists at one time, who were in those situations and now have gotten out, and collecting that wisdom and putting it in one document. Keep in mind as well is that in addition to what Haris has said, that there's resource disparities, is that our community is decentralized, it is divergent, and it is diverse. And so that often means that the left hand doesn't necessarily know what the right hand is doing. We may worship one God, but we don't have one leader. And so that means that lots of times that you will have a lot of different communities that will go off in different directions. And so it's just a challenge in of itself often to cull together the different practices that have been out there, know which ones are the most promising and effective, and then be able to then send the message back out to everyone else and let them know that this is something that can potentially work for your community, irrespective of whatever resources you may or may not have.
Did you bring a copy?
It's available on the copies are available online on the website, on the MPAC website. You can download the full copy. We try to be environmentally conscious and not have too many copies printed, but you can definitely download it online. Yes.
Any other questions? Yes.
I want to
Could you please state your name and affiliation? Thank you.
My name is Khalil. I'm from Al Hurra, which is a TV station. So my question is only how you describe the extremism and radicalism, and what are like the basic data of this extremism? Because sometimes I think there is a risk of a mistake, and there is also a risk of making people fear and be aware about. Be aware and very. They try to make themselves far from you, and they yes.
It's very important that to make it clear that what we're talking about here is people who prescribe or believe in the ideology of using violence to achieve a political agenda or to address their concerns or whatever it may be through violence. That's our concern here. As Harith have said, that does not include people who disagree with their government, speaking forcefully about policies and so forth, because the message we'd like to give to the Muslim community is that you should have the right to disagree with your government, to start campaigning on the issue that you're concerned about, whether you're lobbying your congressman or congresswoman or senators and so forth. Because people sometimes misunderstand this issue even within the Muslim community. Taking a stand against our government in foreign policy does not put you in the categories of being radicalized. Not only that, is the most healthy way and preventing people from being radicalized to feel free to speak against policy, don't disagree with it. Because that's what we like to teach them, that you can be able to be yourself and to speak your mind, because this was all this country is all about. It's a free country to disagree with policy when you think that it's necessary for you to disagree.
Anyone else? Yes.
Hello, I'm Kamal Thomas from DHS, and I would like to address, is there any type of system of accountability in regards to making sure that each community receives the proper training, and even more so, in the long run, is there, excuse me, some type of research that will be taking place to ensure that the system, the model, the toolkit is as effective as you guys hope will be, and figuring out if there's any other applications or any other changes that need to be made.
Great. Thank you. That's a great question. It's probably the one question that I'll probably be able to geek out on for a quick moment there. Basically, yes and yes. So there will be training that's going to be going along with this. For instance, even while I was writing this toolkit, I made sure to be able to take training with private consultants who have had decades of experience, people who used to work, for instance, for the Secret Service. And so being able to take that training then and make sure that it is reflected then in this document personally. So I'm not just giving advice then to people without having gone through it myself, number one. Number two is that we do have a curriculum that we are finishing up right now that involves people who specialize in these kinds of things, adult learning methodologies, as well as a current law enforcement instructor who has run these kinds of exercises in the past. So we are definitely working in consultation with the right kinds of experts to make sure that there's the appropriate kind of quality control. And as for evaluations, I think is what you're really kind of getting at, we are also discussing right now with a number of university-based centers and subject matter experts to see, as we're rolling this out, to have data collected and the appropriate steps to make sure that scientifically rigorous evaluations are being conducted so that as this program is continuing, we can continue to refine it further and further and further so that not only are we being effective when we're addressing this to the community, but hopefully that other people who are interested in looking at this program may have something to learn from it as well.
Since Alejandro used big words, I'll just use very small words to talk about our training. Yes, what we do is once a community decides to pilot this program or implement this program, we go in, we hold what we've been calling our tabletop exercises, where we train the grass tops. Counselors, imams, leaders, youth pastors, we bring them in a room, give them training for about half a day, do the tabletop exercises with them, give them a sense of understanding, because as I said earlier, American Muslims are not thinking about violent extremism on a daily basis. And they shouldn't be expected to think about violent extremism on a daily basis because they think about what every other American thinks about. Their job, their mortgage, their kids' education. But we want to give the necessary people in each community a level of training where they can become competent in discussing these issues and then seek out resources as well. So that's the key. We go into communities, train them, and try to build a network and stay in touch with them.
My name is Gregorio Veras. I'm a reporter from Mexico. I just got here, and I apologize if I ask the same question. But how events like the marathon attacks have increased the backlash or problems for the Muslim community in the U.S.?
So, yes, I mean, after any attack that takes place, after any time where our nation goes through a traumatic experience, there is an issue of perception. There's a rise in hate crimes. There's a rise in how people view the American Muslim community. And so that happened post-Boston. But what was interesting, and maybe Imam Webb can address this, was that Boston itself came together as a city. And I was just in Boston the past few days, and Boston Strong was everywhere, and it wasn't an exclusive Boston Strong. It was an inclusive Boston Strong. It was all faith communities, all ethnic communities coming together, and I think for us, we at MPAC believe that that's the best way to push back against this narrative of violent extremism. Is when we come together as a nation and say we're inclusive, because people like Anwar Awlaki and some of the other peddlers on the internet, what they say is that look, American Muslims, look at you, your government, has trampled your civil rights, your fellow citizens look down upon you, and the best way to push back against that narrative is to say no. And I think Boston was a great example of saying no. We're together, we're standing together, and even though there are instances, but those instances aren't just specific to the American Muslim community. I mean, yesterday reminded us that anti-Semitism is alive and well in this nation as well. This individual had been around for many years, for decades, and was part of the KKK. He had been spewing anti-Semitic rhetoric online. So this is a problem that we have as a nation, and it's not exclusively an American Muslim problem. We have to make it an American issue.
What I'm seeing in the community, to be honest with you, I would say that, in Boston, what we did prior to the bombing was built real deep, meaningful human relations with clergy across the community, as well as even the atheist community. So those relationships were built over time. Trust was built over time. We had personal relationships that really, those organic relationships carried us through any of the challenges that we had. Secondly, I would say that the greatest catalyst for attacks on Muslims actually is the Islamophobe industry, more so than the acts of violent extremism. If you were to compare the number of really, I would say, hate-filled kind of tangents on AM radio on a daily basis towards Islam and Muslims in this country, compared to the number of violent extremist acts that happen in this country, I think you'll see a great difference. Recently in Sacramento, California, a man was killed in cold blood at a grocery store. A supporter of Bush Jr., who was killed by someone affected by the Islamophobe industry. I myself, on Fox News, I was called a Qaeda operative. I look like a Qaeda operative and a Muslim Brotherhood sympathizer. And I've received threats because of what was reported in the news. So I would say that the catalyst for attacks on Muslims in America is not necessarily acts of violent extremism, but what we're seeing is a response to $18 million have been put in the Islamophobia industry since 2008. And now we're starting to see people buy in to that narrative.
And when we see more, even people in Congress attacking directly the Muslim community, do you believe this is a sign that these type of Americans are becoming more intolerant? And not only intolerant, they are becoming violent against people of another faith or race.
Would you like to say that? Go ahead. Well, you know, as a nation, I'd like to kind of put a scope out a little bit. As a nation, we're in the past few years, we've had challenges with inclusivity in general. It's the American Muslim community. You have people like Michelle Bachmann. You have people like Joe Wilson, Alan West, people like that whose rhetoric was very anti-Muslim, who was extremely anti-Muslim. But you know, some of the good news was someone like Alan West didn't get reelected because that type of divisive language and agenda did not work for the people of Florida. But you had people like Joe Wilson when he made a comment at a community center in suburban Chicago. There was a hate crime right after that in a mosque in that area as well. So you see this, but this is not only limited to American Muslims. I mean, we see the rhetoric around immigration reform, and that's a very heated and at times, unfortunately, very problematic rhetoric that comes out towards Latino Americans, towards African Americans, towards Jewish Americans. So those fringe groups and individuals exist, but they have a loudspeaker, unfortunately, now. You know, as Imam Webb said, you have talk radio, you have so many other outlets, the internet. So those will sometimes be amplified, but I think it doesn't represent the general public's feelings. It doesn't represent America's feelings.
I'd like to say,
Sure.
Regarding the response from the larger community, we have an organization now that part of the Eastern Islamic Society of North America is a member of it. It's called Shoulder to Shoulder. This have about 29 religious institutions, from Catholic, uniform form of Judaism, conservative, name it, who came together and says we will not allow attack on Muslim community and violation of their civil liberty. And now they've been working on this. We have staff who are full-time on this issue. Therefore, as you may see the other side, but there's a broader side also, where American leaders from the faith community have really come forward and says that we would not accept attack on the Muslim community, attack on one religion is attack on all religions. And they said we would like to protect this public square and freedom of religion for all Americans.
Yes. One more question. You know, Horace, you said several times something that made me think a lot about how violent extremism is not, as you said, a source of dinner conversation in American Muslim households. I think it is. I think that whenever there's a Boston bombing or a Madrid bombing or whatever bombing, you go, God damn it, not again.
Right.
You know, I think a lot of homes of Muslim Americans are so anxious about not being perceived as bad that these things affect them a lot. And so my question is, can't that be turned into a learning opportunity? In other words, what tools are you giving, parents who are sitting around the dinner table, and of course in the religion of Islam is very respectful of elders.
Right.
What tools are you giving people's parents and grandparents to say, yes, this terrible thing has happened, but not only do we not want to be blamed for it, here's what we can do about it.
That's good. Well, I'm glad you asked the question because then I can clarify my point. You might be having more dinner in American Muslim homes than I have, but no. But I think that you're right. When an event takes place, when there's an act that takes place, definitely American Muslims are talking about it. They're talking about it because it'll impact their kids in terms of bullying at school. It'll impact the perceptions at work of a woman who seems like she's a Muslim. It impacts the Sikh American community, who has to deal with the brunt of a lot of the hate crimes that comes towards them. So there definitely is a dinner table conversation. What I meant was countering violent extremism and the nuances, the details of what communities should do and what parents should do. That doesn't take place around dinner table conversation. But like you said, this is exactly why we're coming out with this initiative a year later, during the anniversary, so because people will probably be talking about this now. People will address it. I mean, the nation's going to be talking about it. There will be memorials. There will be news reports. That's why you guys are here in this room. And that's why we want to give these tools, whether it's how to have parents pay attention to what their kids are watching and doing online. That's key, online. To allow them to have discussions about grievances in the mosques. Post 9/11, for a while, there was a spook factor in our local communities. People weren't willing to talk about their differences with government policy, whether it was the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, drones policy, in public settings, in faith-based public settings, because they thought the FBI might be watching, they thought that the government might be surveilling them. So there was this spook factor. What we want to do is say, no, you live in the United States of America. You're a citizen, you have a right to disagree with government policy, and you have a right to do it publicly. And so to have those healthy conversations. And I'm sure the imams can talk about this and how they create these safe spaces, because they come from model communities that help create these safe spaces. But that's what the kit is about, is to give them the tools, at least the leaders in the community, so that they can host workshops, trainings, for this to actually take place. Anyone else?
No, I just said earlier that we did have this workshop for parents about internet safety, and they do come to us that we're worried about radicalization online, but also that has just mentioned the issue of bullying and how it impacts their children after every event. Therefore, we need to teach the parents how to talk about this issue to their children as well.
In terms of tools, there's just one other small thing to add. The tools aren't also just for parents lots of times, or for clergy, sometimes even for friends too. Because a lot of folks, maybe peer-to-peer, feel more comfortable with one another. And in the toolkit, there was one particular story that really sort of honed in and almost kind of got to me a little bit too. It was a case where one of my interviewees actually had regular communication with Samir Khan, who was the now deceased editor of the Al-Qaeda English language magazine, Inspire. And he had developed this relationship with him over a number of years, and was having conversations with him lots of times about these issues. And one of the things he told me was that before my interviewee had gone off to graduate school and had lost contact with Mr. Khan, he felt like he was starting to make some progress in building rapport and also starting to change his views. But by the time he had actually tried to reconnect with him, the next thing he heard of Samir Khan was that he was on the news and he got drone striked instead. And in that process, when he was talking to him, he didn't know where to go. He just felt like he needed to talk to this individual the entire time, but he had no place to turn necessarily. And so one of the things as well is that when we're talking about these recommendations, a lot of it is also geared towards college students too, and young people. So this way they know that if they have a friend who they're concerned about for their well-being, they have a place that they can turn to.
So I think we have time for just a couple more questions.
Megan Gates from Security Management Magazine. I know you were talking earlier about communities piloting the toolkit. Have any communities come forward, or any communities currently using the toolkit?
So we're in the first phase of piloting it. We will be making public those communities that are going to implement it fully. But at this point, to ensure that they feel comfortable and that their privacy is because in a lot of this, a lot of focus of this is privacy of communities as well, making sure that they're comfortable in terms of implementing a program and not having the media's eyes always on them. So we're not releasing the names of those communities. Once we go through the process and we start to see implementation, they feel comfortable, then we will go ahead and release the names. Yeah.
Yes.
I want to know, are there, I read, excuse me, I had the opportunity to read the toolkit, and in the component of the ejection model, the ejection aspect of the PI model, it says that there's two components to it. One is that you remove the individual from the space, and then the second part is notifying law enforcement. However, someone previously addressed that there has been some type of tension between law enforcement and the Muslim community. And so are there definitive measures to help improve the relationship between the Muslim community and the law enforcement as well as education?
So, you always ask the good questions. Yes, there are attempts, and part of what we do in the actual toolkit is list those resources, and in the communities that we go into, we encourage constant communication, especially between the FBI and local communities. So a lot of times, remember that American Muslim community institutions, they don't have full-time staff to engage on this issue. So they don't even know who the local FBI field agent in charge is. They don't know the JTTF people. They don't know the U.S. attorney folks. And so what we're trying to do is, as we go in, to introduce them, to have them engage. And not necessarily just to do community forums or community engagement, because a lot of the post 9/11 relationship that took place between federal law enforcement agencies and Muslim communities was just about community relations and community engagement. I think we're beyond community relations and community engagement now. Now we need to talk about actually doing real work together. And so there are good models in places like Northern Virginia, Washington, in Los Angeles, in Detroit, where relationships have become healthy because there's been some real difficult work where people have rolled up their sleeves and gone beyond the rhetoric and beyond the fringe on both sides and have actually sat down to work together. And so when we go into each community, we introduce, we help facilitate conversations, and we do it in a working environment and not necessarily in a public environment.
All right, well, thank you all for joining us today. This concludes our press conference on our Safe Spaces initiative. I believe our speakers will be around for a few more minutes if you'd like to ask some follow-up questions, but thank you.